This is my third time this year in Germany. I try to bring together the two concepts of the conference from a historical perspective and arguing that they were historically had certain level of hostility, but today we see an emerging partnership. Why and how they are now becoming allies. So this is the dependent variable, the authoritarianism problem in the Muslim world, well documented in Freedom House and many policy data sets, showing us that in the world, out of 200 countries, we have 60% electoral democracies, but in the Muslim majority world, out of 50 countries, only 14% are electoral democracies. And I've been studying this for about 20 years now, and every year we are losing some democracies. They are turning to autocracy, Maldives Islands, Burkina Faso, Tunisia, in various degrees and with various forms. And when I look at this map and the data, many people may think that it's a result of Islamism. But in fact, I've been studying constitutions in these countries, and my first book, as Professor Khurshid also emphasized, was on secularism. And when we put them in a table, we see that, in fact, they are not all Islamists. And constitutionally, at least 22 of them are secular states, and 13 of them mention secularism in the constitution. This is a secular republic, or this is a secular state, in different forms, laïque, secular, Almania. And this is very rare because in European constitutions, only France has laicite in the constitution. And in American constitution, we don't have secularism. We only have the First Amendment referring to separation. So despite the fact that 13 of them explicitly, 9 of them implicitly mention secularism, and only 17 have Sharia in the constitution and 11 have mixed regimes, we have a broad trend of authoritarianism, because in this table you see the bold few democracies like Senegal, Indonesia, Kosovo, Bosnia, and with some problems we consider them as democracies. What does this tell us? To make the long story short, it tells me that secularism is somehow necessary because all 17 are autocracies on the Islamic Sharia-based constitutional side, but secularism is not sufficient because 22 are secular with many autocracies. It shows us that authoritarian secularism is the general mood in this 22 category, and many of them are nationalist, secular regimes. And now we are seeing that both forces, secular authoritarianism and Islamist authoritarianism, are making this map of the problem. Initially, as I said, they were kind of enemies, at least competitors. Because in the Muslim world from 1920s to 1970s, there was a very strong secular mood. After 70s, Islamization became prevalent, and voila, you have this mixture of regimes because of this two competitor trend. So one trend started with Mustafa Kemal Atatürk of Turkey, the first Turkey Muslim majority secular state. Then it was followed, influenced, imitated by Iran under the Pahlavi regime, Jamaluddin Shah of Afghanistan, then certain secular framers in Bangladesh, Indonesia, the Ba'ath parties in Syria, Iraq, Jamal Abdel Nasser, and then following militaries in Egypt, Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia, very strong secular trend. And during this trend, we see, in fact, a broad debate, and this did not start with the Muslim world. The tension between transnational religion and nationalism is a fact of Christianity too. When you look at the scientific literature on nationalism, scholars like Benedict Anderson and Anthony Smith emphasize how secularism in Europe emerged in contrast to the transnational, extraterritorial authority of the Pope, Ecclesia, and the Latin language. They defend national leadership, national political community, and vernacular languages. And in the Muslim world too, Islamists generally defend a transnational notion of caliphate and ummah, understanding of community, and emphasis on Arabic language, bringing Muslims together, whereas secular nationalists, from Atatürk to other examples, emphasize national community leader and vernacularization of the Islamic rituals. In Turkey, there was the Turkification of azan, call to prayer, as a symbol of this emphasis on the local language. And in the Muslim world, there was an extra debate. When you look at this table, I tried to summarize one debate on law. According to Islamists, there should be Sharia law. According to nationalists, secular law. And in terms of education, Islamists defend a madrasa-based system, whereas the other side, reformist modern institutions. And in terms of foreign policy, a more Islamist dimension for Islamists, and then national interest is the core of foreign policy. So this clear division from the general debate on Christianity and Islam to the modern debate on Islamism versus nationalism started to transform. One thing to keep in mind is that the notion that Western governments are always supporting secular nationalists against Islamists is a very wrong notion. Because at least United States and United Kingdom, we know, had much troubles with nationalists and had a very complicated relations with Islamists. For example, in the case of Iran, Mossadegh came to power as a nationalist in 1950s. Then he was deposed by a coup organized by United States and United Kingdom. Even President Obama recently, a few years ago, admitted that we were behind the coup. And another nationalist, UK and US, attack was Nasser, and Nasser's understanding of Pan-Arabism. And the struggle really gave some space for Islamists in their competition. That's one thing that weakened nationalist secularists. Another thing, of course, was the year of 1979. And after 1979, nothing remained the same. Islamists gained ground, nationalist secularists lost ground. One thing was obviously the Iranian Revolution. Another thing was the seizure of Grand Mosque by a group of Wahhabi radicals, which gave the signal and lesson to House of Saud that they should be radical, otherwise there will be more attack by certain Wahhabi groups. Last but not least is the Afghan jihad, supported by the United States. You are seeing President Reagan in the Oval Office by Mujahideen, the Afghan fighters. And during these transformations, of course, there's international dimension, the domestic issues, then there was a financial dimension. Because petrodollars of Iran and Gulf states have been used to promote certain notion of Islamism, and both Saudi Arabia and Iran use oil money to disseminate their understandings of religion and politics. And three agents use these resources to promote legal and socio-political Islamization in the Muslim world. One group of agents was clearly Islamist politicians, Islamist groups. The other group was ulama. And the ulama have not been emphasized sufficiently. They are the doctors of Islamic law, they are the clergy, but they are not as visible as the Catholic Church, except the Shia world, where they are very visible. But in the Sunni world, theoretically, the ulama is not a class of clergy, ruhban, and the clergy, layman, layperson division is not clear. But in practice, ulama have a monopoly on the Islamic discourse. when Professor Khurshid or myself make a claim about Islam, the ulama say, who are you? Intellectuals, non-ulama Muslims, you cannot talk about Islam. You have no authority. And these ulama gave certain bases for Islamists, and they were overlapping. For example, Khomeini was both an Islamist and an alim, a member of the ulama class. Recently passed away, Qaradawi was both an Islamist and a member of the ulama class. And the notion that Islamists and ulama are always in competition is a very wrong notion, because when Ikhwan al-Muslimin came to power in Egypt, they draft a new constitution saying that Sharia is the base of constitution, which was already in the Egyptian constitution before them. But they say the Council of Ulama of Al-Azhar define what Sharia is. That's the new thing they brought. Very surprisingly, the third group is the Sufi sheikhs. Normally, you would expect Sufis to be open-minded, tolerant people. Sufism in general is, but Sufi sheikhs represent a hierarchy, an order. And in many cases, from Turkey to Pakistan, they've been active supporter of Islamization. They've been active supporter of Islamic governments and leaders. Therefore, these three groups really work together in this Islamization project and weakening. And when weakening secular nationalist reform projects. And when, as a result of international relations, oil economy, and active promotion of Islamism by ulama, Sufi sheikhs, and the political Islamists, secular nationalists came to point that there should be a new rapprochement and a mixture, and there should be a new combination of Islamism and secular nationalism. Economic rentierism was one important dimension. And what we are seeing now is that the Egyptian military, which was in 1950s, 60s, was a representative of socialist secular nationalists, are now a very good ally of House of Saud. And Sisi has been presented as an Islamist figure with his wife, with his thesis written in United States about the importance of an Islamic state. But the changing relationship between Islamists and nationalists is not one-sided. It's not Egyptian military becoming more Islamicized, but at the same time, Islamist leaders getting closer to nationalism. One example is Erdogan. Until 2012, Erdogan had big problems with nationalists. But in 2014, from that time to present, he established officially a coalition with Nationalist Action Party. You see the leader of the party, Bahçeli, Devlet Bahçeli. So they have now an official coalition, Islamists plus nationalists. Another interesting case, the MBS of Saudi Arabia. He is now sidelining the Wahhabi ulama and claiming a more nationalistic position in Saudi Arabia in their own term. Therefore, this is a new combination in each case with certain complications. And what we see is that the Islamists and secular nationalists now emphasizing their shared views. They have always been, both sides have always been certain degree of statists, etatists, patriarchal more and by and large. Of course, secular nationalists were more for women's rights in Turkey and in some other cases. But still, patriarchy remained a very problem for nationalism and discrimination against minorities. And now they are really neglecting their previous debates about law, education, foreign policy as a mixture of both religious and secular emphasis on law, education, foreign policy. And what really brings them together these days, two discourses. One discourse of anti-Westernism for Islam and the nation. It is a common discourse. Another is being anti-liberal for traditional values, blaming neoliberalism for the problems in the country and in the world. And what we are seeing now is that these two are merging. But this is not only in Muslim majority countries. If you remember the photo of Sisi and the King Salman, I cut the third part because the third part was Donald Trump. And this is one of my favorite photos where you see how American populism came together with Egyptian and Saudi leaders. And in fact, this is not a coincidence because there is a very strong connection now with the global trend toward populism. With the example of Muslim world, we see Islamic and nationalist forces coming under a right-wing populist government. And a common background for all of them is the decline of the left globally after the collapse of the Soviet Union, communism, socialism, you name it, decline in many parts of the world, and ideological power is losing its appeal. And anti-liberalism and anti-elitism are the common themes and common discourses. In the United States, Trumpists challenge established elite, and then the anti-liberal attitude is shared globally by populist movements. And the result is a triple alliance of a demagogue leader, nationalism, and religious conservatism. And in many cases, we see how this global trend also supports Islamist and secular nationalist combination in the Muslim world. When you look at United States, when he was president, Trump emphasized America first and American nationalism with a conservative emphasis in the Supreme Court. Now we have a supermajority of the conservatives. And with the Muslim ban, he tried to mobilize his bases. And in Russia, President Putin bring together Russian nationalism and Orthodox Church with an anti-Western, anti-liberal discourse. And recently, Patriarch Kirill supporting the invasion of Ukraine. And another case is India, where Prime Minister Modi emphasized Hindutva, combined an ethnic and religious nationalism against Mughal history and certain policies discriminating Muslim minority. So 2 or 3 years ago, BBC Hindi invited me for an interview. Then I replied that I don't study India. Why are you asking an interview? They say Erdogan turned Hagia Sophia into a mosque again. 10 days later, Modi is going to build the foundation block of a Hindu temple on the shrine of the destroyed Babra Masjid, the Muslim mosque. And we see parallel, and we want you to discuss. Then I told them that I will only accept if you let me include Donald Trump, and it will be nice comparison of Trump, Erdogan, and Modi on their common notion of religious nationalism and populism. So in the Muslim world, when we look at the sources of authoritarianism now, there is the economic basis coming from oil. There is the global populist background, and this really help the combination of Islamism and secular nationalism. And this picture may make some people very pessimistic, but I think there is also possibility of change, democratization, re-emphasis on minority rights, freedom of speech, and women's rights is possible. In my recent book, Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment, I suggest a political transformation, starting with the dismantling of ulama-state alliance, dismantling of religion-state mergence, and proposing a religion-state separation. Together with decentralization, the expansion of women's rights and minority rights, and re-emphasizing freedom of speech. of course, this requires an economic transformation, and it may come when the oil era ended. You know the joke that Stone Age ends before the end of stones, and oil age may end before the end of oil. But with the new technologies, even the depletion of oil itself in certain cases we have seen in Bahrain, Indonesia, the oil money will be gone, and that may create a new transformation with re-emphasis on property rights. And then this may lead us to a social transformation, because what I argue in the book is that the Muslim world really needs an intellectual class and a bourgeois economic entrepreneur class to challenge the ulama state or the religious class and political class. That makes me hopeful about the future, and this is a possibility of transformation we may see. So thanks for listening, and I'll be happy if there are questions, and of course I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Bitte vor, wer traut sich, den Eisbrecher zu machen am Anfang des Vortrages? Ich denke, eigentlich müsste genügend Inspiration vorhanden sein. Ich warte einfach mal kurz. Ja, bitte, hier vorne der Herr.
Thank you for your presentation. And chicken and egg question. You told there was this reciprocal relationship between ulama and the state. But now the state actors tell the ulama what they should say in khutbahs on Fridays. Now it's very useful instrument. Will this? What is now? Who has the upper hand? The state or the ulama? Or the state or the ulama are instrumentalized? First of all, thank you.
Thank you for your excellent question, and it is a big puzzle whether the ulama is the source of problem by its ideology and religious interpretation and shaping politics, or it is the ruling class which make the ulama junior partner and subordinated. And since the publication of my book, I've been dealing with this discussion. And in Norwegian city of Oslo, there was a one-day conference. In the morning, an historian said that you exaggerate ulama. It was the sultans who had power, and even today it's the political leaders. And toward the evening, the same gentleman said that you are exaggerating political leaders. Ulama is behind everything. And I said, you are the same person, right? But it showed that when we look at from one angle, we see Iran, that the supreme leader, guardian council, mullah class, the ulama, now Taliban in the Muslim Sunni world imitate and say, let us say no, we are the state. But if you look at from another angle, you see Saudi Arabia, MBS, with the monarchical authority, can sideline the ulama. In Indonesia, there was a TV program to discuss my book. They criticize with this example. They say, Saudi case proved that it's all about state. Ulama didn't play any role. But in every case, I think it's a symbiotic relationship, because the ulama provide the political class a political legitimacy, a discourse, a religious justification, and immunization. But political authority provide ulama, of course, financial resources. In Turkey, Diyanet has about 100,000 officers paid by the government agency and from the budget. And also protection. And together, they declare any dissenting views as blasphemy or apostasy. And they have laws and ways or mechanisms of punishment. And one last point I want to emphasize about this complex issue is from history. When you look at the history in the Ottoman Empire, there are two chief ulama, Shaykhul Islam, for each sultan. It shows that sultans were changing the leader of the ulama. But at the same time, it was the ulama who issued the fatwa when the Janissaries revolted and changing the sultan. And the only way really today for Muslims who want to reform certain notions of religion and politics is to dismantle this alliance, because it is a very strong hegemony, ideologically, culturally, and it's very difficult to convince masses for new ideas unless the idea of din wa dawla, din and wa dawlat, religion and politics, make this strong combination. It's very difficult. If they somehow dismantle, there will be really a new energy and certain dynamism can occur. That's my hope.
Thank you very much. Ich denke, Herr Professor Pollack in der dritten Reihe ist der Nächste, der eine Frage hat.
Okay, thank you very much for your stimulating talk. I have a question rather specific, and this question pertains the historical roots of the fusion between nationalism and Islamism. And you mentioned the ulama, and the ulama is not clear what is meant by the ulama. They are legal scholars, but are they clergy, or are they do they belong to the laity? It's not clear. And my question would be, could it be that the fusion between secular and religious values contributed to the fusion between nationalism and Islamism? Or to put it in another way, to what extent would you say that the roots of the alliance between Islamism and nationalism lay in some specific characteristics of the ulama in Islam?
Thank
Please,
you.
yes.
So, when we look at initial debate between nationalists and Islamists from 1920s to 1970s, ulama were to great extent marginalized, because when we look at the origin of secular nationalism, it started in Istanbul, Ottoman Empire, by the Tanzimat reform. At least it has a background, of course. Mahmud II, what he did was to abolish the Janissaries. Janissaries in Istanbul had a very strong connection with the ulama. That's why historians says that the Sultan, by abolishing Janissaries, cut the strong arm of the ulama. Muhammad Ali Pasha already did it in Cairo. He abolished Mamluks, who were historical allies of the ulama. Then he attacked the ulama and confiscated certain waqfs and their properties, etc. That's how it began. And in terms of education system and ideologically, they lost grounds in Turkey, Egypt, elsewhere. But once secular ideologies, parties, leaders lost credibility for various reasons, you can see it's circular. Secular circle followed by Islamism. Maybe in the future, Islamists lost their appeal, there will be new secular backlash. Now we have some survey data how new generation in Turkey, Iran are becoming more secular. That's a possibility. Another thing is the socioeconomic problems. In Egypt, in Turkey, secular governments were not able to establish really strong secular developmental trend. But eventually, the ulama came back with a very strong Islamist discourse popularized by not only themselves, but also Islamists and Sufis. And theoretically, they adapt certain nationalist discourse. For example, when you look at Turkey today, from Diyanet point of view, Turkish nationalism has no religious problem. Theoretically, you may assume them to say that, oh, nationalism is against or understanding of transnational religion. But no, they are not saying, they are very pragmatic. The same pragmatism in the United States. For example, when evangelicals are asked about Trump, saying that he is not a religious person, Why are you supporting? They say he's a means and he is the way of us dominating the Supreme Court. So there is a certain level of pragmatism, and in practice they solve the problem. But as you mentioned, there is also a theoretical tension. And in Turkey, for example, in a post-Erdogan era, there will be a huge problem on between nationalists and Islamists and between other groups, because Erdogan is not like Atatürk. When Atatürk died, he left an ideology behind. Erdogan is more pragmatic. And this kind of leaders, Erdogan, Modi, Trump, Putin, the lack of strong ideological component is their strength that makes them very pragmatic and adaptable. But at the same time, it's a weakness because in the long run, we don't know what the legacy will be.
Thank you very much. Ich glaube, hier vorne war noch eine Frage. Sonst gucke ich auch mal in die Runde hinten. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your very, very interesting presentations. I have two questions. One is concerning one of your later points, the rise or the challenge posed by the bourgeoisie. And when I look, for example, into the case of Saudi Arabia, I think we can see it, that there is a tendency of the bourgeoisie to go against the leadership, arguing in favor of political participation rights and so on and so forth. But I'm wondering how that kind of transformation they have in mind should actually take place. I mean, that means tremendous disorder in the worst case. So how do you assess that? And the second one is concerning Egypt and the role of the armed forces. And I was a little bit surprised that you argued there is a tendency whatsoever in favor of Islam or even Islamism. So I have been working over the last 5 years very closely with the Egyptian armed forces and training officers and so on. And actually I could not see that tendency so much in a way you described it. So what are the indications you see in a more concrete sense? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Both are great questions and really require more time, but since we have
take your time.
We have time? Okay, then I'll go on. Thank you.
Go on.
So,
we love to listen to you. So.
Thank you. You are very generous. So the bourgeois question, Veli Nasser wrote a whole book 15 years ago, arguing that this is that moment of change in the Muslim world. There is a new bourgeois class in Turkey, the Anatolian Tigers. They refer to Max Weber's Protestant ethics and the spirit of capitalism. Voila, you have the new bourgeois class, which represent this worldly asceticism, a la Max Weber. Other people say United Arab Emirates and the Gulf countries having a new bourgeoisie. But the change promise didn't come. And I think the main reason is that most of these examples represent crony capitalism. In Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, UAE, there are business people, but they are strongly connected to government. They don't represent an independent bourgeoisie as we understand as a political actor. And the Saudi king or Sisi, they can easily sideline if any of these economic actors raise a political concern. In the case of Turkey, this so-called conservative Anatolian bourgeoisie were playing a balancing role when there was a secular government. But now Erdogan government make them subordinated, and they either pledge allegiance to the government or they were eliminated. Therefore, they lost agency. That's the problem. Regarding the very complex question of the Egyptian military force, let me briefly say that Jamal Abdel Nasser, although Sayyid Qutb and others first consider him as a member of Ikhwan, tried to represent a more secular state, but he had this challenge because he tried to integrate al-Azhar into state structure in order to challenge Ikhwan and say that we are also good Muslim. Look, al-Azhar Sheikh is with us. But eventually al-Azhar became too much powerful. Then after Nasser came Enver Sadat. And what Sadat did was first to put Sharia in the constitution as a source of law. But Islamists were not satisfied, therefore he made it the source of law. And since the time of Sadat, Egyptian army no longer had any problem with Sharia. Then during the Morsi administration, Morsi put al-Azhar, Morsi and Ikhwan, to the constitution. 6 months before the coup, I was in Cairo. I interviewed 11 days the Egyptian elite, especially Muslim Brother leaders. And then I asked them directly that, are you aware of a coup attempt or a possibility? And they said, no, it is not possible, and Sisi is an Islamist. Sisi had a wife who has a hijab. And then Sisi, when he was in American academia, wrote a thesis about the importance of Islamist state. And what I observed is that in my interviews, Muslim Brother leaders really regarded Sisi as an Islamist. Then he came to power. After that, he organized conferences and tried to be the leader of Reform Islam. But he was not taken very seriously. So these are the symptoms I am observing, starting with Sadat, all the way Sisi, in the personal life, in the public discourse. And the last point I will emphasize is that Egypt today is an Islamic state, ruled by armed forces. What I mean by Islamic state, since 1990s, Egyptian courts can declare whether someone is Muslim or not. For Nasser Abu Zaid, the court decided that he's an apostate and his wife is a widow. And he and his wife had to leave the country. It was Egypt controlled by armed forces, and armed forces did nothing. So the Grand Mufti office is issuing fatwas, and it is the country that Sharia courts, apostasy, blasphemy. Of course, it's not Iran, there is no supreme leader. But Egyptian armed forces seem to be happy with this Islamization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Sahan, glaube ich, du hattest dich gemeldet.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir, for the interesting lecture. My question, I have only two short questions. The first question is, can Islamists be included in democratic processes? The second one is, what do you think about the term moderate Islamist we had during the Arab Spring?
Thank you. These are very tough questions because, first of all, in a democracy, how can you exclude groups, right? There's a big challenge. In order to have an open society, you should be open. But the open society also needs to protect itself. For example, if a group says that when we come to power, we will establish a system where those who have commit blasphemy and apostasy would be killed. Will you allow this party exist? What are the boundaries? Right? These are big questions. Therefore, normally, again, since I am German, I keep referring to Max Weber. Ideal type Islamist, the moderate Islamists, they should be part of democratic society, and the hope, the moderation theory is that the more they engage with elections, the more moderate they will become. That's the hope. The second question about the Arab Spring, I think if you ask me who the moderate Islamists are, I would say Rashid Ghanouchi and Nahda in Tunisia. So I had the chance to interview her daughter, and then 10 years ago, during the Arab Spring, and she explained to me that she is doing a law degree in Cambridge, And then I told her that Muslim brothers have many engineers and medical doctors. I think it's a problem. She said, look, we have many philosophers and law degree people like myself. And then I asked Ghannouchi at that time, if one tried to put Sharia in the constitution, why you didn't try to do it in Tunisia? He answered that this is a divisive issue. I don't want to divide the country. And also, I live in the United Kingdom. They don't have even a constitution. Why is it so important to put Sharia in there? So I regard them moderate. And there are cases of all the three groups. For example, among the ulama, Nahdlatul Ulama in Indonesia are very open-minded. I visited Indonesia last year, and this group, Nahdlatul Ulama, tried to reform certain notion of Islam. They reject the notion of kafir, infidel. They say every citizen in Indonesia is equal, regardless of Muslim or non-Muslim. They reject the notion of Sharia, saying that the Indonesian parliament issue laws, that's binding. And they reject the notion of caliphate, and then they regard me as a Turk, not American. I'm Turkish-American, but they say, you Turks had the caliphate, we don't believe in them. I said, we no longer have that. We abolish it, right? 1923. So there are some ulama, Sufi, Senegalese Sufis are very open-minded. So not all Sufis are part of an Islamic project. In Senegal, Sufi tariqas are contributing to democracy. But in the Arab world, it didn't work. Arab Spring, it didn't work, unfortunately. We kept saying that Tunisia is where Arab Spring began, and it's the only democracy it produced. But even Tunisia today is not a democracy, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. Mohanad Kohid. Gibt es sonst weiter? Gut. Gut.
Thank you, Ahmed. I have only one question. In Germany, we observe that the I don't know how you call them, Graue Wölfe, Grey Wolves, the Turkish organization of Grey Wolves, or okay, you know what I'm talking. Yes. Yeah. In the 1980s, there were more nationalism, and in the last years, they are becoming more Islamism. Are you observing this in Turkey or in other countries in the world? Can you say something about this coalition between nationalism and Islamism in the Grey Wolves?
Oh.
Thank you very much. This is a very timely and great example of that, because in 1970s, the Milli Görüş Akıncı young people organization and the nationalists, Ülkücü or Bozkurt Grey Wolves, they were separate and competing and opposition. And when I talk, my friends from the National Activist Party, they say the Milli Görüş people, they are Islamists, they don't have loyalty to the nation. Their loyalty to Islamic Ummah. So it's a major division between the two. So no longer today, because all of them watch the TV series Ertuğrul, Kuruluş. I'm joking, of course, but the TV series are crucial in making the public discourse. Even outside of Turkey, in Pakistan, elsewhere, people watch the TV series and which promote neo-Ottomanism. And this neo-Ottoman discourse that we are great, make Turkey great again, with combination of nationalism and Islam. But is it perpetual? Will it continue like that? This is a big question. I think eventually there will be a clash because they are coming from different backgrounds, different perspectives. Now they reach a point, but is this sustainable? We will see.
Thank you very much. I'm also going to talk about that in my later on about this combination
about the contradictions.
Yes, about the contradictions and how it can work. So I'm glad that there is already the bridge. Sarah Bemrich, bitte, und dann.
You also mentioned Sufism and the sheikhs and
Mikrofon.
No, it's on.
Oder näher?
Näher,
Ja.
yeah. You also mentioned Sufism and the Sufi sheikhs and the triangle with Islamism, and I've been asking myself for a long time about this political Islamist dimension within Sufism. You just mentioned right now there are also Sufis in other countries who contribute to democracy, but let's come back to Turkey as a really good example. So before 2012, let's say, we had the Gülen movement, who was most probably occupying this place in Turkey, in this triangle. And since the coup, we have other Jamaats and tarikats like Naqshbandi who occupy this place now, are not gone. And when we go back to history, you also mentioned it, the Yeniçerites had a similar position maybe in the past in Turkey, or in the Ottoman Empire at this time. So I've been asking myself where this political Islamist dimension within Sufism comes from. Do you think that does it have an ideological base, or is it something that has historically grown?
Thank you very much. That's a very complex question because I have personal sympathy towards Sufism, and that's why it's a personal puzzle for me too. How come this very tolerant, universal understanding of life becomes so politicized and became source of authoritarianism, as I put. To give a short answer to your very complex question, Sufism starts with a personal experience, Rabia Adawiya as a female mystic. Then it became more organized by tariqas, Naqshbandi, Qadri, and others. Then in the Ottoman Empire and in the Arab world and Iran later on, it became much more engaged with governments, and maybe purposefully political leaders make them adapted to political systems, and they became highly politicized. Today, there are two major problems. One problem is the hierarchy. So the Sufi orders put the sheikh in a hierarchical position where individual liberty and individual free will is almost denied. And in my Islam book, for example, I quoted two Sufi saying that these are anti-democracy. One is that those who don't have a sheikh has this devil as their sheikh. And the other is about the importance of the sheikh for your spiritual life. Then the question, when the sheikh asks disciples to vote for a party, is there free will, individuality, to say, no, I'm not voting for that party, I will vote another one? If not, how can these groups be part of a democracy? Of course, they promote autocracy. Another thing is, theoretically, there is no adaptation because there is too much emphasis on medieval notion, glorifying the past. They live in the past. I make the joke that Ahmed of 2023, Sufis or others, would not care what I say. But if I present my ideas to them as a 13th century scholar, Ibn Ahmed, Abu Hassan, then they would listen because they emphasize history. They live in history. All the Sufi stories, all the narration is all about history. Because the life we have, modern life, is corrupted. We are egoistic individuals. We seek material interests. But the people in the history, they were so pure, innocent. This is a fantasy because we know that people in history were not better than us. But that's the problem, I think, in Sufism.
Thank you very much. Professor Teschan und dann hinten Yassin Yahyawi.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your talk absolutely. You mentioned the opposition between secular nationalism and Islamism, also Islam. I would add another dimension. there has been from the very beginning an alliance between nationalism and Islamism, also Islam. Maybe you could also say something too, because maybe not for the Kemalist versions of nationalism, but right-wing or conservative Turkish nationalism, Islam has played always a very important role. And this nationalism was grounded on the mission in the salvation history of Islam, and vice versa. And Turkish success of Turkish nation was granted prepared by Islam, their Islamic belief. I think this it doesn't contradict to your thesis, but that could be helped to differentiate, and not only in the Turkish Islamic synthesis, but it's much more elder and found in a formulation, political, intellectual formulation, at least from the 70s and 80s in the Turkish Islamic synthesis. Thank you.
You want to comment it?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think you are right, and your examples clearly remind me the Turkish Islamic synthesis idea since 1980s exists around. Yeah, you are right that from history to present, there are many moments of coming together, then division. So, life is full of trade-offs. Sometimes we say, oh, I can do this and that and this together. Then sometimes we say, no, these don't go well together. For example, Sarah refers to Gülen movement. Gülen and Erdogan were together. They could live together, but no. There was a backlash, clash, then Gülen and Erdogan and Gülen is lost. Nationalists and Islamists, will this marriage go on, or will there be a divorce in Turkey and in other cases I mentioned? We have to look at the conditions and causality. For example, the global populism today, how do we explain it? One thing is social media, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and everything challenge the authority of academia, established media, established elite. And this really give rise to populism and the idea that your PhD, your being a columnist at New York Times is no longer important. And once again, I can't stop myself quoting Tayyip Erdogan. He said, they say you are a professor, who cares, right? So that's the mood now. And Donald Trump also says it's false media. The established credibility of New York Times and centuries-old institutions no longer important. So there's an important pillar now. Social media makes populism popular. Another thing is the ideological polarization in the United States and certain cases, whereas in Turkey now these two forces find anti-Westernism, anti-liberalism as a discourse to come together. But we'll see how long it will continue.
Thank you. Die Dame vorne.
Thank you very much. I think in Turkey, the modern group is also fighting for equal rights and try to make the modern art of Islamic as a leadership for the Arabic world. But if you speak about nationalism, you have it in all religion in West and in Eastern. But my question is, what can we do for the future? I think so many Muslim people are living now in Europe. Is it not now time to make a European Islamic reform with all these academics from the different groups? And we need you, international academics, to make a reform of equal rights also in this group. And if you have education in all religion, then you will only get the democracy, because all the sharias are so similar and they all make, you know, Autoritärer or national kind of politics.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question about the future. So I am a strong believer of agency. So agency and structure. Agency put efforts. If structure allows change, change will come. But until structural change happening, we should keep putting efforts. That's what the opposition in Turkey is doing. In terms of the very important issue of reform, I think Muslims in the West has a crucial position now because of the authoritarianism in the Muslim world. It's very difficult to elaborate new ideas. It's risky, it is dangerous sometimes, but Muslims in Europe and in North America may come up with new ideas to influence the Middle East and elsewhere. But unfortunately, the opposite is happening. The Middle East is coming to influence Muslim in Europe or North America. And that's the problem, because the views coming from outside are ignorant of local conditions. And I remember a debate about mortgage. A scholar from the Middle East came to a Western country and then say that mortgage is haram. And then after he left, people laugh and say he had no idea how we are living, buying a house, what mortgage is, etc. But the question, if you are laughing after him, why did you invite him to talk? Yeah? Why didn't you produce new ideas? If you really need religious justification, you know your local condition. Why are you importing an imam from the outside? Why don't you produce ideas? And these ideas eventually may go back and influence the Muslim world. That's the hope and possibility.
Thank you. Ich habe noch Herrn Yassin Yahyaoui hinten als Frage, richtig? Genau. Und dann glaube ich, noch eine letzte Handmeldung hier, genau. It's okay for you, two last questions.
I'm here.
We enjoy having you here and having the opportunity to ask a lot of questions.
As much as the time you give me, I'll talk.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Kuru. I have here a question about theory and historical methodology. Can we generalize your theory, especially the solution you presented at the end of your lecture, so that we should solve the relation between politics, leaders, and religion, ulama, to the entire Islamic world? You start your presentation by the Ottoman Empire, by the model of Ottoman Empire, and after that the model of Turkic nation. And we know that the Ottoman Empire model was very influenced, especially it is in the heart of the Middle East. But in the 18th and 19th century, there was also another model in the West or in the Islamic West. For example, the Sultanate of Morocco, or Sultanate al-Maghrib, or also the Kingdom of Morocco. I have just here in mind Morocco, otherwise there is other example, for example, Indonesia and Malaysia also. So in this model, the function and practice, and also the discourse of the Sultan and the ulama and al-Tasawwuf are different somewhat from the Ottoman example or the Ottoman model. So the question here again is to what extent your theory can be generalized?
Thank you. This is a great question. I was in Morocco a few months ago, so I received the same one. So when my book published 2019, many people raised the question whether it is Middle East oriented only or not. And then it was translated into Indonesian, and a big debate in Indonesia, maybe 20, 25 newspapers edit and review, big debate. And I was surprised. I wasn't expecting any interest in Indonesia. Then when I went there, I asked, they say, one thing is about the Muslim Golden Age, my book emphasizes, because my argument is that the problems we see today is not part of Islam's core essence. Before the 11th century, there was no ulama-state alliance. In the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, there was certain separation between ulama and the state, and that was the dynamism created, and that was the secret behind the Muslim golden age of science and economy between 8th and 11th centuries. The separation between ulama and state and coexistence of Greek philosophy, Christian and Jewish minorities, and the heterogeneity and diversity in Muslim thought create a great civilization. And Indonesians also taught me that we are now seeing the rise of ulama-state alliance in our country. That's why we pay attention. In Pakistan, they taught me that what you discuss as ulama-state alliance, we call in Pakistan Mullah military nexus, Mullah military alliance. Since the time of Zia ul-Haq, there is a strong army ulama connection in Pakistan. So I see also in Malaysia that this notion of ulama-state alliance today exists in Southeast Asia, South Asia, not in Central Asia to that degree because it's a post-Soviet era, post-Soviet region where state really control ulama to some extent. And in other part of the Muslim world, what I am really suggesting for the future is that the cliche that Islam does not allow religion-state separation, whereas Christianity allows, because Jesus says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, render unto God what is God, is a very wrong, misleading cliche, because Islam had a long history of religion-state separation, and Christianity had a much more complicated relationship which cannot simply be explained by a sentence in the gospel. So therefore, I'm trying to give hope about the future. And in fact, in every translation of my book, I insist that this Renaissance painting is to be used, which three philosophers, Greek philosopher, Muslim philosopher, and Renaissance philosopher, to show the coexistence and a better future. Only in the Arabic translation, I just presented to Professor Khurshid today, they use a dark image. And I asked them, why not my colorful Renaissance painting? They said, because your book is a dark, pessimistic book. And I said, no, I am very optimistic about the future. Muslims had a great civilization. If they go back and understand the roots again, they can repeat it.
Thank you very much. Ich denke, wir haben einen letzten am Podium, eine letzte Frage. Der Herr mit dem grauen Pullover, genau, wenn ich das richtig gesehen habe. One last question. Thank you for your patience.
So first of all, thank you very much for your presentation and all that insightful input and the ideas you gave us with that talk, Professor Kuru. I have a lot of questions, but as we don't have time, I'll just narrow it down to two smaller ones. So one would be, I don't know how much this might maybe blow up a bit the context of the presentation you gave us because it wasn't really in there as far as I noticed. But what would you say might be the possible dynamics in the future that we may see anywhere between the Balkans and maybe even the most eastern parts of Russia, as we saw, for instance, with Ichkeria in the past, and now Chechnya, that in this case, for instance, Europe didn't really do anything and said, well, this is an internal Russian affair. And then with the two Chechen wars, we saw how gradually it evolved from, well, what Dzhokhar Dudayev basically proposed there, to now having Ramzan Kadyrov in power and a completely different interpretation of Islam there. And also, the other question would then be regarding the role of Europe and otherwise the West, but then again, I feel like, for instance, the UK and the US have a different approach in many aspects as compared to Europe in this regard. For instance, on the question whether or not to support different sectarian groups or different branches, basically. As we saw in the Iraq War, for instance, we saw the US more so supporting the Shia groups then, and also being quite close with the clerics at times. And you mentioned Senegal. I was wondering, I mean, obviously the Sufi tariqas there are much more, let's say, obviously active in politics, but at the end of the day, you still have the Marabouts being very closely connected to their communities, even here in the diaspora in Europe, and still, you know, people being very, very tight with them and receiving orders from them on, as you said, who to vote for and things like that. So, sorry, it's probably going a bit too much, but yeah, the question, how do we, what should the role of Europe be in regards to the foreign perspective there, and then the domestic one as well? Thank you.
Thank you. So I may write an article to answer all the questions, but basically the issue of giving attention to details or making generalizations, that's the major challenge for social scientists. You know the story of the king once upon a time invited the wise men of the country to bring a map of the country. They brought a map and he looked and say, "Oh, I don't see the mountains, it's too small." The wise man brought a bigger map. The king looked at it and say, "Oh, I don't see the forest and the lakes." And every time the scholars bring a map, the king asks a bigger one, and at the end they brought him a map which is as big as the country itself. And at that time there was no point of making a map. So of course we make some generalizations as a map in order to clarify certain points. And regarding your question of the role of Europe, I think Europe is more crucial than United States. The reason is that in the US, Muslim minority is smaller as a percentage. And since Black Lives Matter events, we have an emphasis on race and the fight against racism. And we don't have much debates about these critical issues. We do, but it is a relatively lesser degree. And since Europe is geographically closer, has a historical ties, larger number of Muslims, has a deeper debate, it is important, and North America really can learn from the debates in Europe. And in Europe, of course, there are Muslim majority countries too. I was in Bosnia this summer, and in Bosnia there was a lively debate going on, what it means to be a European Muslim. And again, by referring to I'm a political scientist. One of the reasons why I study history, especially the Muslim Golden Age, is to tell young Muslims that certain concepts we discuss these days, such as coexistence, multiculturalism, importance of science, rationality, these are not simply quote-unquote Western values that you have to adopt and imitate. No, you have a history of these values. And in fact, there were moments that Muslims were teaching Europeans philosophy, Aristotelian philosophy and other things. Therefore, take them as your authentic, proper, universal thing, and then feel free as a Muslim, be part of democratic society. That's the message I'm trying to give. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is a fantastic last sentence for this conference. Yes, I want to thank you for your patience, of course, for your brilliant answers. Und natürlich möchte ich Ihnen auch ganz herzlich danken für die Teilnahme, für die vielen, vielen Fragen. Ich denke, wir hatten eine sehr gute Eröffnung für diese Veranstaltung. Und ich möchte auch noch wirklich darauf hinweisen, wer noch nicht genug hat von dem Thema, dem sei wirklich das aktuelle Buch empfohlen von Herrn Kuru über Islam, Authoritarianism and Underdevelopment. Es ist wirklich gut. Ich habe es gründlich durchgelesen, selber als Politikwissenschaftler, weil es eine wunderbare Symbiose ist von Politikwissenschaft und Ideengeschichte. Da gibt es leider nicht sehr viel. Also wer weiterhin noch Fragen hat, ich denke, bei dem Thema hört das nie auf, sei wirklich an dieses Buch verwiesen.